Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Chris Littlefield, a global expert on employee recognition and workplace culture. Chris will share how to spot the subtle signs of disengagement, why meaningful recognition matters more than you think, and how simple conversations can make all the difference in retention and morale. Because most leaders want to keep their best people, but unfortunately, the reality is many employees disengage long before they ever say a word. In fact, one study claims over 52% of employees who quit believe their employer could have done something to make them stay. So the challenge, leaders often mistake that silence for satisfaction. So if you're a leader who wants to create a culture where people feel valued every day, well, this episode's for you. So let's dive in. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Tell us more about your background and really what got you interested in this work.
Well, I don't have your traditional background in most people working in leadership development. I actually started doing international conflict resolution work. So doing what's called track 2 diplomacy work, facilitating dialogues between Israelis and Palestinians, Indians, Pakistanis, Greek and Turkish Cypriots. And then I started doing similar work. Well, I actually did work with folks from all sides of the Syrian conflict in the heart of the civil war in Lebanon. And then I started working with senior UN leaders. And then some of the toughest dialogues of all, because I started getting pulled into companies to facilitate between marketing and sales. And so what I realized doing that work is that many times the things that were drawing us into conflict could have been easily avoided if we were doing some of those little things every day. And then as I was realizing that, I also had a toxic relationship with two of my coworkers, and we're all conflict resolution specialists, and a 15-minute recognition activity transformed a 2-year toxic dynamic that we couldn't break out of no matter what we tried. And so that's when I just realized that recognition and appreciation, when we reframe what it is away from rewards and awards, actually is conflict prevention. And so if we do those things on a daily basis, then we have the kind of relationships that we need to be able to have tough conversations, to be able to give tough feedback, to drive performance and push people to absolutely do their best work. And so that led me into it. And that's what I've been doing for probably the last 15 years now.
Love to hear that, and you have so many great insights to share. Why don't we first move into a topic that I think a lot of leaders struggle with, and that's, silence doesn't mean satisfaction. Many leaders assume that if an employee isn't voicing concerns, well, they must be happy. But you've mentioned through your articles is that you talk about the subtle signs of disengagement. What are some of those key indicators that a team member might be noticing, or you might be noticing in a team member where they're kind of checking out or possibly even considering leaving?
I want to step back before answering that question and first look at answering the question of the assumption that many leaders think that because an employee isn't complaining, because they're doing great work, because they are a top performer on the team, that everything's okay. Because I can't tell you how many times, and I'm sure you've seen this in your work too, where a manager's like, I can't believe one of my best people just gave notice and I had no idea. And I usually say, that's because you, like, the fact that you were blindsided is probably the reason why they're leaving. Because we assume that because people aren't complaining that everything's going well, but many times our top performers are the ones who aren't going to speak up when there's an issue going on because they don't want to be an hindrance. They're a person who just gets things done. But because they do that, we assume that they're having a great experience. And, one of the ones I think in the article you were mentioning right there was an employee who was top performer, fully engaged, talking about all the things in the future. And then because the boss neglected them, they never talked about career development, never talked about career growth, and only talked to them when something went wrong. And that's where they hit the I've had enough moment and gave their notice. And that was the surprise for leaders. So I think the 3 early warning signs that I share with leaders to keep an eye out for. And I think an important caveat on this is that, it's like for people who are watching this and not listening to it, I've got my arms crossed right now. Many times I go, well, what does this mean? You're closed off. No, it means I'm cold because it's freezing where I live right now. So many times it's an indicator, not a fact, but it's something to keep our eyes out for, that when we see it, hey, maybe I want to dig in a little bit deeper. And so the 3 things that I have people tend to watch out for is one is loss of sense of humor. And so when people stop joking around together, when they stop being playful, they may just be stressed. It may be something going on outside of work. But if we used to joke around and poke fun at one another, and now all of a sudden I say something and you roll your eyes, or you don't laugh anymore, or we stop joking around, if it gets tense, then there may be something going on. Another one is I stop showing up, either mentally or physically showing up. And so if I stop showing up, meaning like I call out sick all the time, or I stop showing up to meetings, or I may be in meetings, but I stop sharing inside those meetings, is another indicator that something may be going on. I had one coaching client who actually applied for 75 jobs all during work hours and took a job in Afghanistan to get away from his boss in Beirut. It's what I call an inspirational leader, the wrong kind of inspiration, but he just checked out. He's like, you know what? No one cares. My boss is a complete jerk. And you know what? I'm just going to do whatever. And if he had an interview at that time, he'd just go to the interview. And then the third one is we stop talking about the future. And so we stop talking about what's going to happen next year. We stop engaging in those conversations about what we can create together. And so I think those three indicators are the ones that are probably the biggest kind of early warning signs that something is happening, and we may want to check in with our people.
Well, that's such an important point because disengagement, you're right, starts subtly at first. And that really leads me to my next question is that you recommend having these stay conversations quarterly or at key milestones. Have you found that employees respond differently based on how long they've been in the organization to these conversations?
A couple things to answer your question there. I think that the idea of a stay conversation is, many people are familiar with the concept of an exit interview, which means that you've already given your notice and it's too late and they're kind of a waste of time. And people are rarely going to be honest unless they're really frustrated about their experience, and then they'll dump everything onto the company. So the stay conversation, the intention of doing it is that instead of just checking in when things have gotten bad, check in on a regular basis just to talk about, is somebody having the kind of experience that would make them want to stick around? So I think that's the intention of doing it. And now I think one trap that leaders fall into, regardless of what the topic is they try to follow a pattern of, I'm going to do this and this at this time, and this is the right thing. We're going to do the same thing for everybody. And they don't adjust, but you're not going to give your spouse the same thing on your first anniversary that you are on your 50th anniversary, right? Like if you get to that point, right? Because it's not going to make sense because your relationship has changed. You know each other more. You know more about that person. So we're not going to do the same thing with an employee who's been there for 1 year than one that's been there for 10, because people's needs in life has changed. And so I think that in general, one thing that's important for leaders to remember is that our employees are on a journey. They're on a journey, and how long that journey is with us within our company is dependent on how much value they're getting out and how much we're helping them advance towards accomplishing what they want to accomplish in their personal life and in their professional life at work. And so for a newer employee, we want to be checking in after a couple times a year to say, hey, how's your experience going? Do you feel like you're learning? Do you feel like you're growing? If it's a senior leader within the organization, we're not going to talk the same way because we have a different relationship. We do want to check in. Hey, how are things going? Hey, you know what? I know that so-and-so just got that promotion that you were hoping to get and you didn't get it. I want to check in with you and see how you're doing. I want to make sure that you're having the kind of experience that you see there's opportunities for you to learn and grow, regardless of not getting the position that you hope to get. And that kind of goes, Charles, to the next important aspect of when do we have these conversations. Is there certain career triggers? And the number one for people is when they get a new manager. So if there's a reorg or a merger or somebody else gets promoted and that person's going to report to somebody else, huge career trigger, because I've spent all this time figuring out how to work with this person, and then they leave, and then I'm going to get a new manager. I have uncertainty of what's going to be my experience there. So that's one career trigger. The second one that Gartner found in their research was when people have meetings with friends and family. So around the holidays or when people go to like high school or college reunions, because they start comparing themselves and they go, oh, wait, you're a VP? You're a president? I'm only a project manager. How come you're there and I'm here? You're making how much? that's when they start to compare and look. I think right now, at the time I was recording this, people aren't going to be looking for new jobs as much as before because there's a great deal of uncertainty within the economy, within politics, and all the rest. So I think that may be different, but we always need to have that on the radar. And just, I think a good rule of thumb is that maybe, 3 to 4 times a year, just sit down and not have a performance conversation, but a conversation just to check in. And this, I know, is a long answer to your original question, but to go back to the first one is, I think one of the ones you were asking is it going to be different for each person? And I think, yes, understanding where they're at and then checking in with them and then setting the context. Hey, I'm not here to tell you what you need to do better or how you need to grow. We can have those conversations. My goal is to make sure you're having a great experience here. And I want to know what's working or not working to make sure that you're having the kind of experience that would have you want to stick around.
Let's talk about the other person in that conversation and trying to shift the leader's mindset with these conversations, because some leaders might hesitate to have these stay conversations because they fear opening a door to the demands they can't meet. So how do you coach leaders to shift from seeing these discussions as a risk to recognizing them as a strategic advantage?
I think that most people will avoid having these difficult conversations because they're scared someone's going to ask something or they're going to want something that they may want themselves that they can't give. Well, I don't want to talk to them because they may want a promotion. They want a raise. Maybe this person thinks that they should be a senior manager and they're 6 months in the company and they're 22 years old. So I don't even want to bring it up because it's going to be uncomfortable. I think that if we think that way, what's likely to happen is that person is going to leave, because then we never talk about it. The difference between that and being able to open up the conversation, because it's better to understand what that person wants, because the sheer act of asking somebody what they want and what's going on, well, I'd like a raise. And then what we want to do is, so why is that important to you right now? And what most people share, and this kind of comes from my background in conflict resolution, where people first communicate their position. And what we as leaders always want to do, regardless of the circumstance and what we're talking about, is to move down to interest and needs. If somebody says, I need a promotion right now, well, tell me, why is that something that's important to you right now? And in asking that important second question, we start digging into, well, we're looking at buying a new house, or my kid's going to private school and I need to be able to pay for it, or so-and-so in another department just got promoted right now. And if you as a leader can ask questions without reacting, you can start to understand what that person's real interest and need is. So a great example is I had a coaching client that was in a UN agency. And in the UN system, you have levels. There's P5s, P4s, P3s, P2s, and that's, kind of a P2 is the lowest. Probably should have gone in the other order when I shared this: P2, P3, P4, P5, and then directors, and then executive directors. And so people want to move up. I'm only a P4 and I've been in the UN for a certain long time. I want a P5. And so I said, okay, why do you want that right now? And it's like, well, I've been here for 4 years and I should have moved up. I said, great, why don't you go interview a P5 and ask about that experience? Well, she went and interviewed that P5, and the person goes, you don't want this position. You love doing the education work you're doing. You don't have to be involved in politics. If you move up that next level, you're going to make about $8,000 more a year, but your life is going to be hell because you're going to stop doing the work you love doing. So you could be attached to the number that's next to your name that means nothing to anybody outside the UN, but you're going to lose the part of your work that probably brings you most joy. I've actually thought about going back to being a P4 myself.
And this is, all talking about building a better culture at work. And another area that I see that really leaders struggle with is giving compliments, giving and receiving compliments at work. And your research shows that many people really feel discomfort when receiving compliments. I had Marshall Goldsmith on the program not too long ago, and he said the best advice that he gives with that is just to say thank you and shut up. Do not try to give the gift back to them and say, no, I don't deserve it. But what are some strategies leaders can use to create a workplace culture where really appreciation is more openly embraced?
Well, I think, and I love that you shared what Marshall shared there, because one of the things that in the research I found that the number one thing people associate with being recognized is being valued, which is foundational to the retention of our people. But I also found that nearly 70% of people, which is a number that I know to be much higher, those are just the ones who admitted it, associate embarrassment or discomfort with the process. And I think what most people don't realize is that when someone's recognizing us, they're sharing a gift with us, and they're sharing their experience. And that the recognition is many times more about the giver than it is about the receiver. But because we're bad at delivering the message, we don't know how to respond. And we've also been trained to be humble. And if we want to get better at giving it, we have to first get better at receiving it. And Marshall's tip is the same thing that I often share, is that just to simply say thank you. And if it made a difference for you, let the person know. Now, the other thing, just kind of in the realm of accepting compliments, because we have to start by no one's going to ever hire me to train people to accept compliments. So, or to train people to accept recognition, but that's really probably one of the most foundational things that we've got to get better at if we want to improve it with an organization. Because if a senior leader in an organization, somebody recognizes them and then they divert it and they say, oh, it's no big deal, then people in the organization are going to mimic that behavior. And so if leaders are great at recognizing other people, because what we make time for sends a signal to people of what we value. And so one, just saying thank you. And if somebody recognizes us for somebody else's work, like say it was your work and somebody recognized me, I said, well, thank you for noticing, because we want to accept it. I said, thank you for noticing that. However, Charles is actually the one who is leading that project. So next time you see him, make sure you let him know the differences works makes. And next time I see him, I'll also let him know that. So one, learning to accept. And then the next thing is that when we're recognizing folks, I think we're often told the same things, that it should be specific, it should be timely, it should be proportional. And there's one other one that people always share, and I can't remember what it is. For me, one, first of all, it has to be authentic. Now, many leaders, and if anyone is in sales, I'm actually speaking at a sales event on Monday, and many people have been trained to recognize people right before we ask for things. And when I was doing my research, that was one of the 2 or 3 things that people said, which I call the recognition pitfalls, is if I recognize you on a regular basis and then ask for something right afterwards, I call it the butter them up technique. If I'm trying to authentically recognize you, and this is something we often do at home a lot, or our kids do to us, I don't know, Charles, if you have kids or not, but when we do that, when we authentically want to recognize people, the first thought in our mind is, what do they want? And then the other one where we do this is the sandwich feedback model, where we've been trained to sandwich difficult feedback between 2 compliments. And then that has people waiting for the feedback. So I go, Charles, really great having you here. You're doing really great work leading this podcast, but... and any compliment followed by a but is not actually a compliment. So these 2 things, one, learning how to accept, and then 2, phasing out these ineffective or manipulative practices around recognition, are the first keys to get better at compliments. Once we've moved that out of the way, when we're recognizing people, kind of a couple good rules of thumb is that no one should be left with a question after we're doing it about why we're recognizing them and for what. So let's say, Charles, great job in taking notes in the meeting the other day. Isn't it my job to take notes? Thanks for showing up at work. I have the option not to show up at work. No, so it's saying, hey, thanks for taking notes in the meeting. I know it's your job to do that, but the fact that you did it so well means that I could step back and focus on doing my work, and that makes a huge difference. Hey, thanks for showing up on time. I know it's your job to show up on time, but the fact that you show up on time every single day, and then you let me know when you're not going to be here, gives me that peace of mind that I always can count on you. And if something happens, you're going to let me know. And that just makes my job so much easier. And so we forget as leaders that we can recognize those day-to-day things. And this is where a lot of my work when it comes to recognizing employees is helping leaders decouple things like rewards and awards from recognition. And so many times people collapse those gift cards and plaques and certificates and all that other stuff with recognition, where rewards and awards aren't recognition in of themselves, they're a delivery tool for the message. And so the message is what creates the meaning. And so it's getting leaders to be able to figure out how to craft that message in a way that is truly meaningful to that employee and has them remember it and get seen and recognized for the things that matter most to them.
Absolutely. And I've seen that time and time again in fast-paced work environments where feedback is often focused on what needs improvement. I had Chester Elton on the podcast many times. He's self-proclaimed as the apostle of appreciation. And he said, there's a difference between recognition and appreciation. You need to be recognized for things that you do, the results that you deliver, but anyone can be appreciated for who they are. And I think that's important for managers to understand and consistently recognize and appreciate their team's contributions without maybe having to recognize certain individuals.
And Charles, I would even extend that. And Chester's it's been a mentor of mine for 15 years. Like he's my personal hero. And actually, it was at an IMS event that we got to speak at together. So we got to spend 4 weeks or 3 weeks together. And it was an amazing experience. So I would actually, even in that language, maybe even separate out more where we want to reward people. And so I have what I call the inverted pyramid of importance, which means, and the reason why it's an inverted pyramid is we often put something at the top. And in most recognition programs, they put awards at the top, like your best of the best award up there. So that's the goal where we want to get to. And so we think that's the most important thing, but in actuality, that's the smallest amount of time. And often the thing that plays the smallest role in our relationships. And so I would break recognition as a theme, as all the things that we do to signal to people that we value and appreciate who they are and what they contribute. And that's recognition as a theme. And then I would break it down to 5 core actions. There's appreciating the person, which are the small things that we do every day to signal to people that we value them for who they are and what they contribute. That's saying good morning, like when we hopped on the call today, asking, what are you doing 5 minutes before, just to see where are people coming from? Or, hey, I know your kid was sick the other day. How are they feeling today? And that remembering what's going on in people's lives. And then there's acknowledging the circumstances. And that intentionally remembering the circumstances that people are operating in. I just heard an amazing story with a client who is working in the Middle East, but is from New Zealand, and shared a great story. She goes, I was devastated, but my kid really wanted to go to boarding school in New Zealand. So I just dropped them off, my youngest kid, and it was devastating for me to do that. And I flew back to work, and I immediately came in. And as soon as I came to the office, my boss says, hey, come in here. And sat me down and said, hey, I know that couldn't have been easy to do. How are you doing? And that boss acknowledging those personal circumstances that person's going through. And she goes, I walked out and my first thought was, this is the best boss I've ever had. And then that acknowledging the circumstances is recognizing effort and progress. Because many times leaders think that we only recognize people when they produce the results. We appreciate the person, but we want to recognize effort and progress along the way. And that's that cheering people along that keeps them moving and keeps them feeling like, and the example I say is, imagine you're a player and you had a football helmet up in your office. So we're on the football field and we're, in a important game, but everybody's up in the stands just looking at us, and they're not going to cheer unless we win. One, it'd be a boring game to be at. But imagine you're on the field and everyone's just waiting, and then you lose the game and everyone just walks out of the stand without saying anything. That's why that recognition of the effort and progress is so critical to keeping people moving, and also for them to know that they're moving in the right direction and we have a relationship. And then when we do produce the result, we want to reward people for the results that they produce. And for leaders, it's important to recognize that an incentive is a reward that we receive for producing result within a fixed period of time. And then we want to award standout results. So that employee who goes above and beyond, who closes that massive sale, who creates that innovation or leads that team that creates an innovation that just expands and opens up new market share for a company, we want to make sure we award that person for going above and beyond in our organization. Because if we do, more people are going to start to do that kind of work.
Does recognition look different in remote and hybrid teams?
No. I think that the only difference in remote and hybrid teams that we need to be thinking about is that recognition is really about the relationships. How the goal of all of those actions is that people feel valued. And I think the thing that we took for granted when we were working in person is how much of those informal bump-ins, when we could walk by somebody, where we could see things, where we could get into those informal conversations that happen between our interactions, tend to happen organically. We'd bump into somebody in the hall, in the elevator, getting a coffee in the break room, or out at the Starbucks buying a coffee before work. We'd have those conversations where we could learn about things. But in the remote environment, we have to be more intentional about doing it. And that's why it's so critical to ask questions that invite us into the things that people are working on that we may not see. And so one of the things that I try to teach in my work, and I'll actually, for the folks who are watching, I'm gonna do a visual here to kind of help with this, is that many times what happens, and for the folks who are just listening, I'm gonna explain it, is that many times I'm drawing a line up on the board. We have an idea of some result we wanna produce. So say like at the end of the week, we wanna get 100 things done. And then we work our tails off all week and we get 80 things done. And so we got these 80 things done, but where does our mind go? Or mind usually goes to the gap between the result that we wanted to produce and the result we actually produced. And I'm not saying that we should be celebrating when we don't produce the result, but the problem is that many times we get so focused on the things that we didn't do that we forget to look at the things that we did do. And to accomplish those 80 things, right, we don't just sit down at our desk and there's no interruptions and nothing happens and it gets done. We start out the week and then all of a sudden a new project comes in and then there's some sort of change that changes the whole market, and then a pandemic hits and then a change of administration and all these things goes on. Then our kid gets sick and our favorite show comes out and then we get distracted for 3 weeks and then we get sick and then this goes on. All of that's going on. And usually, I think the challenge, and the reason why I share this right now in our conversation, is when we're working in the remote world, right? We may just see the outcomes that people produce, but people rarely want to be recognized for the outcome. Usually what they want to be recognized for is the ups and downs and the process they went through to produce the results. And it's what we did at work, what we're dealing with at home, and then the stuff that they go through in the head to get stuff done, but we're not going to talk about that. And so as leaders, I think in the remote world or even in person, we tend to recognize people for the things that we appreciate and value. But that alone limits us to what we can see and observe. And so as leaders, a great practice is what I call reflective recognition. And that's an inquiry-based approach to recognition, where I may say, hey, Charles, we haven't spoken in a while, and I don't even know what you've been working on right now. So what's something that you're working on that you're really proud of, or you want to be recognized for? And then I ask that question, then as you're sharing, at first it would be awkward as hell, excuse my language, to be able to answer that question. I don't even know. And this is why if we ask it on a regular basis, people come prepared to answer it. And then we just ask, hey, what did it take to do that? How are you able to get that done? What did it take to do that given the fact that you've got 4 kids at home? What does it take to do that and the fact that you were sick last week and you still pulled that off with the market change? How are you able to get that done? And the act of asking that question and doing what I call positive probing to pull out the lessons, the learning, what we did well, how we grew in the process, helps people get present and helps them break out of focusing on that 20 and instead seeing and expanding that 80. And the best part about that is that when we do that, and we do that as a team, it helps everybody learn from each other's progress and get to see the thinking behind there, which is usually the goal that helps us overcome those gaps in the future.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.